peace, and understanding. Welcome to Critical Thinking. First of all, just want to acknowledge that we will have an interesting topic today. And I want to give a shout out to Dale Flowers, Pastor Dale Flowers, and Dr. Calvin Nicholas, and commend them for all that they do to push the agenda of McKinley Senior High School and put us in a positive light. They continue to work toward a level of efficacy that we strive to attain. So shout out to those brothers and shout out to the McKinley Senior High School family. We had an interesting talk show with Calvin and Dale, Coaches Gumbo, which was very interesting, and we shared some things about the Alumni Center and what's going on with the school, the climate, Coach Gillette being elevated to AD. But I wanted to just come back around and interject some information about the South Baton Rouge community at large, which I never really had an opportunity to share. So today I want to, if time permits, share that information with you. Most of us that are graduates of McKinley Senior High School that are from the South Baton Rouge community know about the legend, the folklore, the tales that have arisen from our community. We know that we have a lot of pride. We know the history of the bustling, once thriving South Baton Rouge community. We know about all the bad raps that we've got over time from people that are outside of the community, not really belonging there or actually dwelling there. So we've had a bad rap over the years, but actually we've taken pride in where we grew up at. I know I personally took pride in have taken pride from being a resident of South Baton Rouge. In fact, my whole family grew up there and was raised there, and I think we came out all right. But have we ever wondered why South Baton Rouge was an all-black community, or just the original legacy of what South Baton Rouge was and where it came from? And I want to just interject and just give a few pointers about that whole scenario. Around 2013, I became very interested with learning the true history of our community as I was in graduate school at that time working on my master's, and I began to delve deeply into research and finding information, going to clerk of court, looking at geographical records, going to LSU, looking at the special Mississippi Valley sections that they have there, all kind of data that's available to be reviewed. And at that time I learned that, wow, how did we become this all-black neighborhood, encompassed black neighborhood? What was the genesis of that? That was very interesting to me. So as I dug deeper into it, I found out that the legacy of South Baton Rouge, that in its totality, as I mentioned when I was talking with Dale and Calvin, that the genesis of South Baton Rouge at large is the Magnolia Mound Plantation. So the whole circumference of South Baton Rouge was the remnants of Magnolia Mound Plantation. Initially, Magnolia Mound Plantation was created from a land grant when the Spanish controlled this area. And it was 930 acres, a vast circumference, 930 acres, which ultimately over time was parceled out and became consolidated into the city of Baton Rouge in later years. But if I may, let me share some information from the text that I am the author of. South Baton Rouge is one of the most recognizable areas within the city. It is the home of a variety of illustrious individuals: Joseph Delpit, Dr. James Frazier, Dr. Leo S. Butler, and H. Rep. Brown, just to name a few. South Baton Rouge has long been perceived as a predominantly black neighborhood, and rightly so. Historical data reveals that South Baton Rouge began to materialize around the close of the Civil War. Its boundaries spanned from the north gates of Louisiana State University and Government Street to the north, the Garden District to the east. This noble area eventually blossomed from 930 acres of the Magnolia Mound plantation. In the year 1904, which is a very important year, Magnolia Mound was sold to Robert A. Hart, who was the mayor of Baton Rouge at this time, for $42,000. Mayor Robert Hart, a native of BR, was the mayor that from 1898, I think he served 2 terms, but he was the mayor when the city became consolidated or incorporated into a municipality. Hart's term was one of great advancement for Baton Rouge. Under Mayor Hart's administration, schools were built, paved, and drainage was improved. He constructed a home for himself on the plantation ground behind the big house, which became known as the Hart House, which still stands today. If you go and visit the remnants of the Magnolia Mound plantation, in fact, you can go there and view it. The facility, at the time Hart purchased the Magnolia Mound, was still a working plantation complete with their sugar home. As time progressed, the city of Baton Rouge began to develop, and Hart began to develop southward, and Hart began to parcel most of the remaining land. Hart subdivided 800 acres and retained 75 acres, including the main house in which he lived. Hart maintained ownership of the Magnolia Mound plantation for 25 years. Transitional years, however, brought about financial hardship for Mayor Hart. In 1929, he sold the property to Blanche Duncan, who sold the remaining acreage with the exception of 8 acres and the 2 houses. She sold them to the city of Baton Rouge. So you can see now that the remaining 8 acres of Magnolia Mound, which exists with the Hart House still in place, and the rest of the area decimated with some slave quarters and a overseer's quarter, and still the big house that has been remodeled over time, remains only 8 acres. So we went from 930 acres to 8 acres, which ultimately was subdivided to create development for a new burgeoning community. In South Baton Rouge, one of the determining factors was plantation life. The massive 930 acres of the Magnolia Mound plantation was an excellent starting point. The nearby Magnolia Mound, which is located on Nicholson Drive and Highland Road in the 1700s, Highland Road was once called Highland Wagon Road because of its elevated position and moving downward. We know that the geography shows that it is very hilly in this area, and you have the name South Baton Rouge because once upon a time during this time period, this was as far south as the city had gone. This was the demographics of the city. So basically anything past Roosevelt Street was swamp and woods. So thus you hear the labels thrown around. In today's time, old South Baton Rouge, we know that the city spreads far south than it does now, but once upon a time, this was as far as the city, the boundaries of the city. Ultimately, Magnolia Mound, this riverfront, the riverfront of the city gave an opportunity for blacks to become employed or seek gainful employment. As the city developed, being a riverfront city on the Mississippi River, downtown developments grew, work post-slavery. So blacks kind of, after the dispersing of the Magnolia Mound plantation, and ultimately in later years it being set up to be sold, a lot of those remaining blacks that were gathered together decided to live as close as they could to work. And ultimately, some of the jobs that had arisen, or employment opportunities had arisen, were providing some form of residency for the people that were able to work there. The African American community experienced a boom between the 1800s all the way into the 1890s. The city of Baton Rouge had become almost 60% black. The black population steadily flowed southward. A traditionally medium-sized town, Baton Rouge's black population was hopeful about its future. Migration from plantations into the Baton Rouge area was an indication of blacks' desire for a brighter economic future. South Baton Rouge's initial suburb or subdivision was engineered by Rainier Schwartz. Schwartz was an immigrant land developer. Since blacks were seeking employment and dwelling in employer-supplied facilities, Schwartz saw the economic logic of affording property ownership or rental properties as an option. This new area contained 427 lots, 427 lots, ranging in size from 50 to 60 feet wide. Schwartz neighborhood was near the older area of Beauregard Town. The geographical area today known as the Bottom grew up from this expansion. It was called the Bottom because of its low-lying tracts and potential to flood at the end of Highlands Wagons Road. Antecedent generations avoided this area because of its flood potential. We all know the stories, and if we dwell in this area that it floods in the bottom, we know the stories of boats being brought in to remove students from McKinley, and just how it just was a drastic flood area. We have an abundance of laughs about that. During this period, new areas were being planned for black families. Extensions further developed on the site of Magnolia Mound Slave Cemetery. The majority of the area has residences constructed on them. The streets in this area were named after states and presidents: McKinley, Hardin, Polk, Grant, and Roosevelt, just to name a few. There had been some changes to the portion of the roads and was of this area. East Polk was once known as Madison, and Thomas Delpit was once known as Texas Street. Financial as well as racial factors led to the location of this new area. Prohibition rules of the period were the norms of racial segregation. Often blacks sought employment as domestic helpers. Lacking the traditional learning, many blacks worked in domestic capacities as maids, gardeners, handymen, and servants. Many of the inhabitants of South Baton Rouge walked to work. Across the southern region of America developed a pattern of African American communities being created on the boundaries of white neighborhoods. One of the more noteworthy transitions to occur, and which created some employment opportunities for blacks, was the building of Louisiana State University adjacent to the opposite area further south past South Baton Rouge. As I said, South Baton Rouge was as far south as the city had gone. In fact, once upon a time, Baton Rouge basically consisted of Spanish Town, Beauregard Town were the first two areas, and then ultimately South Baton Rouge at the development or close of the Civil War in 1865, and then ultimately the planning on up until Mayor Hart purchased the land, but it started off with these 930 acres. So what I'm saying is that the whole of South Baton Rouge was a part of the Magnolia Mound plantation. In fact, Right behind McKinley Jr., McKinley Middle School, or Eddie Robinson, or 13th Street, or even Fannie Street. Behind that, where the Lutheran Cemetery is, on back the whole of City Park, that whole area where the lakes are, that was Richland Plantation. So we had two plantations adjacent to each other, but the Richland Plantation was owned by the Perkins family. Perkins is a name that is synonymous in the Baton Rouge area. You have Perkins Road, and you had Perkins Elementary. You have Perkins Road. Perkins, Segan, all these are names of families that were prominent here. Essen, all these are names of people that once dwelled and were prominent here. But LSU provided employment opportunities for African Americans that lived in the South Baton Rouge area in later years, once that came into existence. Okay. The internal makeup of the community was based on creolization. This is a term that alludes to racial mixtures and multi-ethnic culture of changes. Various aspects of the dominant culture were imitated and carried over for use by others. Within the community, there was crossbreeding without limits, which manifested unforeseen consequences. The plantation lifestyle of the formerly enslaved meshed with the Cajuns, American Indians, Italian, Dutch, European Creoles, as well as the Anglo-Saxons. All of these subgroups gave major contribution to the uniqueness of the South Baton Rouge community. So you're looking at Bonfanis, you're looking at Ragusa, you're looking at a plethora of entities that had come into the community, that lived amongst black in later years. But in a nutshell, I just wanted to state and reiterate that yes, this was and is basically an all-black community, but the origins of the community come from the 930 acres of the Magnolia Mound Plantation. Magnolia Mound Plantation actually has its beginning, as I alluded to, with James Hillen. In 1786, he was given a land grant. I talked about how Baton Rouge was not included in the Louisiana Purchase. A lot of us don't know that because the Spanish owned that tip part of the boot. Thus, you get the Florida parishes, the Spanish West Florida. You also had a Spanish East Florida. You know, this was ruled by the Spanish Empire. But in 1786 was the initial process of Magnolia Mound. You have James Hillen, who were the forerunner, and then ultimately John Joyce, who was an absentee plantation owner that lived in Mobile, Alabama. John Joyce died in a drowning accident, and his wife Constance took over the duties of maintenance of running the Magnolia Mound Plantation, and ultimately she married Armand de Plancher, who was actually an individual from France. De Plancher is a name that resonates strongly within this area, but he married Constance Rashawn, and she became Constance de Plancher. They had several kids, but Duplantier or de Plancher was involved in the actual Revolutionary War. If you look at, as I said, the date 1786 of Magnolia Mound, you have Armand de Plancher being a proxy, if you will, or a favorite son of the establishers of this country. The founding fathers early on, they would have known who he was. In fact, General Lafayette also served the French, fought diligently with the colonies for their freedom because the French and the English had always been at odds with each other in their imperialistic ambitions. So, again, 930 acres is a very large area, if you can just imagine that. But just we look at the steps and time frame, how Magnolia Mound came into being, and how our beloved community is the remnants of that. Can you imagine just where we lived at and played at, that slaves actually toiled the fields? Magnolia Mound was a major fixture on the riverfront for a working sugar plantation. You know, can you just picture boats pulling in and docking and people loading sugar from the plantation over the levee and the boats docking? Just imagine our ancestors toiling or being abused all through the area which we lived, played, went to school with, visited, rode bikes, etc., etc. There is the blood of many lying there on the ground. So again, I was just inclined to point this out because from the last meeting that we had, the last time I had an opportunity to speak with Dale Flowers and Calvin Nicholas, I was asked some questions, and I just kind of wanted to touch bases on this fact again, that the South Baton Rouge area that we know today evolved and has its genesis with the Magnolia Mound Plantation. I hope that this was insightful for us that are residents of this area. I hope that you can obtain some of this information and find it usable. And if you get an opportunity to go to Magnolia Mound, you will see the Hart House still stands there, as well as the Magnolia Mound Plantation. In fact, I've used that as a field trip to take several of my classes there from the university to come and just kind of see what slave quarters look like, what the overseer's house looked like, and ultimately to get a tour of the plantation. So in closing, I want to say always investigate the information you receive. If it is indeed the truth, it should stand the test of investigation. Always ask why. Always ask why. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. Peace.